Good evening and a very warm welcome along to the Neil Oliver Show on GB News, TV, online and digital radio. And no, I haven't shaved and put on a Geordie accent. It's me, Darren Grimes, in the chair this week as Neil enjoys a well-earned break. Now, this week I'll be asking, is inheritance tax actually a fair tax? And does it actually make as much money for the Treasury as you might expect? And as we're now in the run-up to the general election, we'll discuss whether there's a need for electoral reform to create genuine choice at the ballot box. Plus, with the government suggesting all Britons should have 3 days' worth of tinned food and water, I'll be asking, should we be stockpiling, and if so, what for? All that, plus plenty of discussion with my panellists, the freelance journalist, Georgia Gillily. First of all, we're going to get an update on the latest news headlines. Welcome along to the Neil Oliver Show. I'm joined tonight by the journalist and broadcaster, Georgia Gillily. Now, Georgia, it's been a quiet old week, hasn't it? Not much going on.
It's been rainy.
It has, yeah. I mean, did you expect him to be as bold and brave as he has been, as in Rishi Sunak, and call an election?
I'm not sure brave's the right word.
Suicidal, is that the right word?
Let's hope not, for him personally. I think he's doing the best he can with his own situation, and I think lots of people were surprised this week, and I think it's because there didn't seem to be any big change this week that would prompt him to do that. But I think at the end of the day, he's just given up because he knows the result is not going to be a good one. And if they wait until November, say, the result may have been worse.
Is there a chance, though? Because we saw with Theresa May in 2017, right? She was hailed as the next Iron Lady, you know, the next Maggie. 3 electoral successes Margaret Thatcher had. And we all know how that went for Theresa May. Could the same thing happen to an overconfident Labour Party? Does the Labour Party have to be careful? Because Rishi Sunak's criticism is that no one knows what the Labour Party actually stands for.
I think over the coming weeks we'll see them flesh out their policies more. I still think that people aren't enthusiastic about Labour for many good reasons, myself included. But I think after all of the messes we've endured, and also aside from kind of this or that personal scandal, Partygate, etc., people are very upset about the economy, for example.
Yeah.
The ramifications of COVID, immigration is a huge issue which is not being sorted. Doesn't necessarily mean that Labour has a watertight plan to deal with them, as opposed to the Conservatives. But we've already seen how the Conservative Party has been dealing with it, and it hasn't been dealing with it.
No, I mean, Rishi Sunak was forced to admit, actually, there wouldn't be any Rwanda flights take off before the general election on July 4th. I mean, this is an admission, surely, to his voters, many of them Brexit voters, of failure.
Yeah, absolutely. The Rwanda plan is to deal with illegal immigration.
Yeah.
And legal immigration, as we've seen from stats this week, I believe over the past year, net immigration was actually over 1 million in just a year. This is a deliberate policy decision. The small boats crisis is just a small part of that, and that is something the government chose to do.
Yeah, and it wasn't a brilliant look when he was stood there in the pouring rain, absolutely drenched.
No, and they built that fancy conference room during COVID, didn't they? I don't know why it wasn't done in there. I'm curious to see in the memoirs in 30 years' time who made that decision and why. It was very embarrassing, especially with the blaring music from, is it Steve Bray, the anti-Brexit activist?
The EU-mad protester.
You absolutely could not imagine any other European leader or, you know, God forbid, the American president giving an announcement in those kind of conditions. It was really embarrassing, to be honest.
It was making me actually physically cringe. You know, I was sat there sort of watching through my fingers and head in hands. So, it strikes me as odd that any advisor would advise the Prime Minister to go out in those circumstances and actually give this momentous statement, the most important of his entire political career.
It could be that someone thought, oh, you know, if he's standing in the rain and he's kind of putting a brave face on, etc., he'll look as if he's, you know, someone who's able to mount all these challenges. But I think on balance, that's obviously not what happened. Whoever thought that might have been the case made the wrong decision. But, you know, it's not the first kind of PR mishap that's happening in Number 10. There is sort of there's a running joke that his own press advisors kind of want him to lose because there's been so many bizarre mishaps.
Yeah.
But I mean, who knows? Like I said, it's just something that, someone will leak it or they'll write about it in a book in 30 years' time. So we'll wait and see.
Do you think many people have actually made their mind up at this stage? Because the polling isn't perhaps as solid as you might suspect when Labour are that far ahead in the polls.
I think that people have definitely made their mind up.
You do?
On the majority of them to not vote for the Conservative Party. That doesn't necessarily mean that Labour is ensured, people rolling out the red carpet for them. And most people who won't vote Tory will sort of just think on balance, okay, I'm voting Labour.
Right.
But I think people have definitely decided they do not support the Conservative Party anymore, and that includes obviously lots of people who lent their vote to them in 2019 and also in 2015.
Well, he's going to need a drink after that, Georgia. If he's watching, he's going to need a drink to get over that analysis.
He doesn't drink there, does he?
No, he doesn't actually. I forgot about that. He's teetotal.
He can have a can of Coke.
Anyway, Georgia, thank you very much. We'll be coming back to you for more throughout the show. Now, folks, my first guest on the show is Michael Rudkin, the chair of the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters. Now, Michael, along with his wife Susan, was wrongly convicted of stealing money. Now, Michael feels they will never properly be compensated for what they had to go through. Michael, absolute pleasure to have your company. Thank you very much for it. You'll have seen much of the coverage over the last few days of Paula Venables, the former CEO of the Post Office, in front of the committee inquiry this week. Have you any sympathy for her whatsoever? There were a few tears shed there.
Well, first of all, just to set the record straight, I'm the former NC chair of the NFSP. But in relation to my feelings towards Paula Venables, given that she'd had plenty of heads up from the Federation during my tenure, most certainly, that there was issues with Horizon.
Yeah.
But she chose not to take heed of that. And having seen the evidence so far in the inquiry, when you get the chairman of the company at that time, which was Moya Green, that ends up putting in text messages, "I don't believe you, I've lost confidence in you," when we discover that the CEO actually kept the head of legal affairs, Susan Crichton, outside of meetings, waiting in the corridor like a subordinate, who was a very important part within the organisation to ensure that the post office itself complied with the laws of the land. And it's quite clear that what was happening was Paula Venables had got her own agenda. She wanted to be in the limelight, take all the credit, and it didn't matter how she achieved that.
Michael, she said that and I quote, she said she loved the post office and she did the best job and she wanted the post office to thrive for the whole of the United Kingdom. The Sam Stein KC for the prosecution then said actually that was absolute rubbish. Would you concur? Would you agree with that assessment?
I would agree with his assessment. Sam's pretty acute at picking up on these things. Because in general, I can assure you that out of the 11,500 post offices within the network of sub-postmasters, they all love the post office. It's an institution that they love, they worship, and they're proud to be associated with it. But when you've got a CEO who is determined to brandish all of these people as criminals, thieves, it's just absolutely outrageous and unforgivable.
Michael, I'll have a listen to some of what she had to say so viewers get a flavour.
I would just like to say, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to do this in person, how sorry I am for all that sub-postmasters and their families and others have suffered as a result of all of the matters that the inquiry has been looking into for so long. I will answer the questions truthfully, and I'm very aware that they will be difficult to listen to for you and for me, and I ask your understanding in advance of that.
Now, to be honest with you, Michael, I apologise for showing you that because it must be enough to turn your stomach, to be perfectly frank. But I mean, is there any part of you whatsoever that believes that there is some form of a, dare I say, Christian forgiveness and a sentiment of apologising that you can accept ever?
Well, no, because purely and simply that successive CEOs have constantly passed the baton on upwards over a period of time, years, with the same institutionalised problems. So sub-postmasters have had to wait 24 years for these kind of apologies, and the latter being the last 12 years where Paula Venables has been in a position where she could do something for sub-postmasters in relation to the Horizon system, because I honestly thought that when she took her position, this would be a new broom that would sweep clean, that would eradicate all these issues.
Yeah.
And she chose to think of her career first and foremost, and was quite happy for sub-postmasters to be prosecuted and in some cases sent to prison.
Michael, just finally then, can I get your take on the Post Office Horizon Offences Act becoming law just today, a final act of this Parliament? What say you on that particular act?
Well, I took a really deep breath this morning, well, yesterday actually, knowing that this was the last-ditched attempt prior to a general election for this actually to be passed through law, so that all these sub-postmasters, all 1,000 who have got convictions, for them now to be vindicated, to have their judgments overturned, and certainly so that as quickly as possible that this information that's on their personal files is eradicated quickly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Michael Rudkin, thank you very much for your company. Now, in studio, folks, Georgia Gillilly still joins me, the freelance journalist. Now, Georgia, I mean, you've been watching some of the events unfold over the past few days. It's been distracted somewhat by the fact that, you know, a general election was announced. But the last act, one of the last acts of this Parliament to pass the Post Office Horizon Offences Act, that's the whole nation sort of breathes a sigh of relief almost for these people and the hell that they've gone through, as highlighted in that very, very powerful drama.
Yeah, absolutely. So I haven't actually got around to watching the drama, but I've also read
You
about...
must, it's so good, actually.
Okay. I'll set some time aside in the future, but it speaks to kind of the uselessness, perhaps, of some of our political arrangements, that it took that really to tell those people's stories to a wider audience. I know there was already actions before that to try and help people. But for some of these people, it's too little too late. People committed suicide, spent years in prison. I mean, I can't imagine being in that position. It would be utterly despairing to have to go through that. And I think we also have a big headline more recently about the infected blood scandal.
Exactly.
I think there are big parallels there, and to do with how...
It's failures of the state, isn't it?
Faceless bureaucrats kind of passing the buck, as I guess was saying, from his own experience, passing the buck, no one taking responsibility. It's like, these are real people, real people's lives. Something is wrong, and it's not just to do with the post office, it's not just to do with healthcare, it's to do with a lot of things. I think a lot of change needs to be made. But yeah, obviously it won't be happening within this Parliament because it ends today. Yeah,
absolutely. All right, Georgia, thank you very much for that. Now, folks, coming up, I'm going to be taking a look at inheritance tax and asking, is it fair? Is it just? Is it right? You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go anywhere. A very warm welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show with me, Darren Grimes, filling in for the man himself. Now, Anne Robinson, she's a woman that amassed a £50 million fortune as the Queen of Mean on British telly. Just goes to show how being horrible can actually pay. But the TV legend, she's given it all away to her family. And that's in order, folks, to avoid handing it over to HMRC in the form of inheritance tax. Anne says that she'd rather her children enjoy the money now while she's still alive. So I'm asking the question, is inheritance tax fair? Is it laudable? Is it right? And does it actually generate that much money for the taxpayer? Well, joining me to discuss this is the economist Catherine McBride. Catherine, a pleasure to have your company. Thank you very much. What's your view? I mean, is inheritance tax actually a big funds raiser for the Treasury? Because it actually causes a fair amount of heartbreak for a lot of families, does it not?
Yes, and it's a very small earner. It made last year less than 1% of all of the money raised by the Treasury. It's terribly unfair. It basically hits London and the southeast more than any other part of the country. In fact, twice as many people in London paid inheritance tax than all of the people who paid it in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland added together. It's very much a tax on London. It's very much a tax on property, because Anne was in a very nice position to have liquid assets that she could give away to her relatives. But most of the people who are hit by this have wealth of between sort of £1 and £2 million, and it's generally tied up with the family house. So in order to give that away, they'd have to kind of find another place to live. So it's really not possible for most people to give away the money. And the uber wealthy people, like sort of the Dukes of Westminster or Northumberland or wherever, they will set up a family trust, which they started doing tens of years ago, in the 50s and the 60s, to get around inheritance tax. So right now, it's just taxing the people who often didn't expect to ever be in that bracket because their house price has gone up so much that they're getting hit by this. But you can't actually sell your house.
Yeah.
You have to live in it. The other option that unfortunately a lot of people are avoiding this by leaving the country.
Yes.
And Bloomberg claims that the UK is the third most popular country to leave if you're wealthy. And we're up there with places like China and Russia. We're the only country that people leave that would be considered a developed Western democracy. So it's pretty embarrassing, really.
Catherine, what would you say to those who say, well, it's immoral for Anne Robinson to do this, right? She made all this money. She's had a good life. It's actually morally correct for the state to say, we're going to take part of your proceedings in life. You've done well. We're going to use it to fund gaps in healthcare and social care and all these other things. And actually, it's the most progressive way, doing it through property, whilst the person is no longer sadly with us.
Well, actually, Anne Robinson is a good case because she actually made the money herself. But inheritance tax, because it comes in a large lump sum, usually, that is money that if people got it themselves rather than giving it to the government, they would invest. So the Growth Commission, has done a lot of studies on this, and it is the most effective way of growing the economy because people actually invest it. If you're going to inherit £100,000 or something, you're unlikely to just go out and blow it all on a big dinner or something. You're going to invest it wisely, or you're going to buy yourself a house. You're going to think of, something to do with it. Where for the Treasury, it's such a small part of the money that they get each year. It's less than 1%. They actually just blow it. They don't invest it wisely because it's not important to them. It's just too small. So it's a very perverse tax, and it discourages people from saving and looking after themselves. If the government's going to just take it, you may as well just spend it. So then, Catherine, which, doesn't.
Were, a future government to get in touch with you, Catherine, and they say, come on, Catherine, we're getting you into the Treasury, but you're an economist, we're going to discuss the fairest way to raise revenue for the Treasury. If it's not inheritance tax, what is it? Because we've got to pay for public services somehow, don't we?
Well, except if you look at how much they've gone up in recent years, we've now got more public servants than we've ever had. And unfortunately, the productivity of our public service has just gone down and down and down. So I'm not, in fact, sure that we should be taking more money to throw it bad. We've got to start managing the public service the way a private company would manage its workforce. We've got far too many people employed without real jobs. And if we actually got rid of inheritance tax and stamp duty, there's a lot of people in the Treasury, that HMRC, that you could get rid of because you don't need them anymore. You know, you also get rid of thousands of pages in the tax code. You know, you could reduce it by taking whole chapters out and putting it in the bin. So we've got to get rid of these little taxes, and there's at least 10 of them that raise very little money, take up a lot of time of the populace. Because HMRC, they have to go and evaluate the assets sometimes, but most of the work improving the value is done by the inheritors, if you like. So you've got to run around, go through your parents' bank accounts, try and work out what everything was worth, get things valued.
Yes, it's a horrible
at the same time
thing.
as you're organising, and you're also organising the funeral and dealing with, you know, pets and all sorts of stuff that has to go on. So it's a really mean tax.
Yeah,
There's no other word for it.
Catherine,
and it discourages people from building up a capital.
Yeah.
The most important thing we need in this country, Darren, is more people with capital. And this is a way for, you know, the workers of the country who bought a house, did the right thing in the 60s and the 70s, and paid off their mortgages, worked hard. This is their chance to give something to their relatives.
Okay.
And the government's just taking it.
Yeah.
It's just a way of keeping the little man in his place, you know. It's like, no, these guys have
it's a potent reminder, Catherine, of the human cost, actually, to much of this. But we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much there to the economist, Catherine
It's a pleasure. Always good to talk to you.
Thank you. Now, joining me in the studio still is Georgia Gillilly, the freelance journalist. Now, Georgia, do you have sympathy for Anne Robinson? If you had 50 million in the bank and you had some children, would you be out saying, go wild?
I wouldn't necessarily be saying go wild. You know, if my children were teenagers, for example, I think I'd probably say,
yes,
let's
that would
wait
be
a few
unwise.
years to give them that money until they're a bit more sensible. I agree that she did this.
The right thing, you mean? She'd done the right thing.
Absolutely. And speaking as someone who's self-employed and has to file their own taxes with HMRC every year, any criticism of it, I'm happy to be on side with.
It is a nightmare,
It's really heartbreaking.
And have you ever tried to get hold of them on the phone?
Unfortunately, yes. So they should be paying me, really.
Yes.
And what Catherine was saying about our government being inefficient is absolutely true. And I think Anne Robinson's decision is, I think I would applaud it, and I also think it's interesting because we see a lot of celebrities now, very rich people like Mick Jagger, for example, telling journalists that they're not going to leave any money to their children because they think their children should, you know, kind of pull themselves up by the bootstraps, etc. And I think, of course, you want to encourage your own children to be resilient and make their own money and look after their own families. However, I think it kind of goes against the human instinct to not want to help lift up your own children and help them be comfortable, that kind of thing. So I think she has the right instinct as a mother and as a
and there's also as Catherine said, right, there's also when you're suffering a bereavement to that extent, a close family member, and you have to rifle through their bank accounts, you know, value their property and actually work out how much HMRC gets to profit from death.
Yeah,
there's a human cost there.
Yeah, I think it's traumatic for a lot of people to have to do that. And as Catherine was saying, these are people often who, they're not the super rich. They're people who maybe they have a house in London, it's accumulated value over time.
Yeah.
And also, you have to think about, at the end of someone's life, you've already paid so much tax.
Yes.
I'm not against tax.
It's double taxation.
I'm not an anarchist.
Yeah.
But these are people who've already paid for their whole lives. I think you need to kind of limit or take away this kind of interference. All
right, Georgia, thank you very much for that input. Now, folks, coming up, as election fury heats up, I'm going to be asking if the electoral system needs reforming to give you at home more choice at the ballot box. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News, hosted by me, Darren Grimes. Don't go anywhere. A very warm welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show with me, Darren Grimes. Now, Sunak, Starmer, all the rest, they've begun their 6 weeks of campaigning in an attempt to persuade us to give them our vote in the general election. Now, that election has been set for July the 4th. But, folks, I'm asking whether the current electoral system that we have in Britain, first past the post, is actually fair. Let's not forget, UKIP in 2015, millions of votes, one seat. It was 4 million votes for one seat. Is it time for it to be overhauled to offer us more choice? Well, joining me to discuss this further is the political editor of the, formerly of The Express, The Independent now, David Maddox. David, I haven't seen you since you went to The Independent, so congratulations, first of all.
Thanks, Darren.
But actually, where do you stand on this? Because some people say that actually first past the post gives a nation more stability. You tend to get majority governments and therefore they're able to put through an agenda more easily than in Europe, for example, where lots of places have proportional representation, which means more parties, minority parties, have to get together in coalitions to actually form the government. Where do you stand on those two models?
Well, thanks for the congratulations, Darren. That's very kind. I've changed my mind on this. I used to support first past the post for the very reasons you've just given. The stability it gives, the surety of government, and also because, it kept the extremes out of Parliament generally, and maybe you get one or two in there. But now I'm beginning to question it. We've seen a lot of chaos, political chaos in the last few years. We've just been through 3 prime ministers since the last election. So that's hardly a formula for stability. And then, you look at the way this election is really becoming 2 parties fighting over the same ground, largely saying the same things,
Yes.
Small differences in rhetoric, but essentially both arguing that they're better managers than the other. There's no real battle of ideas and things. And what is happening is that the parties with the ideas, with the different opinions, whether that's Reform UK or the Greens on the right and the left, are being squeezed out and are being kept out. So, they could get decent amount of seats. The Greens will end up with 2 seats if they're lucky. With loads of votes. Reform may get 1 seat if Lee Anderson holds on to his, but again with millions of votes, and none of these people will be represented, and I think that's wrong.
Yes. I mean, what do you say then? I guess there's an element here of people feeling a sense of apathy, actually, David. They're saying, I don't want to vote for either of the main political parties, but the ones I do want to vote for don't stand a chance. That creates a sense of disenfranchisement, disenchantment with the ballot box itself. And does that undermine democracy ultimately?
I think it does, and I think this general election could be the all-time lowest turnout for a general election in this country. We already see abysmal turnouts in local elections. If a third of voters come out in local elections, it's a victory in its own right. We may be down to about 50% in this general election. I hope it's not that low, but it's exactly this disillusionment.
Yeah.
Who do you want to vote for? Do you only just have a choice between Labour and Conservative, maybe the Liberal Democrats instead of one of those 2 parties, but generally it's a choice between 2 parties. Whereas if you had a proportional system, there's a much higher incentive to get out there because you can actually vote for the party you want, and that when you're casting the vote, that actually gives them a chance of getting into power, and or at least getting into Parliament.
I'm going to bring in the freelance journalist, Georgia Gillilee. Now, Georgia, where do you stand on this? I haven't actually asked your opinion. Where do you stand on... A lot of people say, well, if you had proportional representation, you would lose the constituency element of first past the post and the link between the constituent and the constituency MP. Are you concerned about that, or do you agree with David?
Many of David's concerns I agree with. However, when it comes to supporting proportional representation, it's not something I can bring myself to do, at least not yet. I think, as David was saying, it makes things more chaotic. I mean, look at Israel, for example. They have one parliament, one chamber of parliament, and they have proportional representation, and they have all sorts of crackpots at the moment keeping the government afloat among all their issues. I think in the Dutch election recently, it's taken them almost 6 months to try and arrange a government, and I think it empowers extremists. And I think we have so many issues with, as David was saying, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak being very similar, and none of them actually willing to do what people want. I think it shows real failures, but it's not the failures of proportional representation, it's the failures of those political parties. They have no organic support. Very few people are members of them or are going out campaigning for them. They get so much of their funding from, foreign billionaires, that kind of thing. That's the issue, the quality of our politicians and the quality of our political culture and culture in general, which is causing this. It's not really proportional it's not really first past the post, sorry.
Yes. So I assume then David would say to that look, the fact of the matter is here that there's going to be no competition in politics until we do have this system, because right now political parties are coalitions, but they're too broad a coalition that actually we already de facto have PR anyway, right? Your constituent MP in Hartlepool might have a massively different opinion to a blue wall, for example, Lib Dem facing seat.
It's very different though, because with PR, you're giving people a seat based on percentages of votes and that kind of thing, rather than winning a constituency. And I think people who are more conservative leaning and maybe people who are more on the centre left will regret doing this. And I think we're seeing issues right now, for example, with Islamist extremism. There's kind of a movement to start some kind of Islamist party.
Yeah, religious.
Which absolutely would get a certain percentage of votes and would therefore maybe have MPs at some point under the system. And I think politicians need to do better, and our culture needs to improve, and our education system and that kind of thing. Everything needs to change. We need root and branch reform, but I just don't think this is the right way. And I think also electoral reform, it's not just about PR. Keir Starmer wants to totally upend the House of Lords and just give us more devolved, useless, unaccountable institutions, and I don't think that's the way to correct our course as a country.
All right, David, you've heard a bit of criticism there. What have you got any thoughts on all of that?
Well, these are arguments that I've used in the past, actually, to argue exactly that case. And but I think, though, I go back to 2016. It always goes back to 2016 with the referendum. Yeah. And the referendum was a sign, really, of how disillusioned people were with politics in this country and how they felt that it didn't really represent them. And, and I think first past the post is actually quite a crucial part of that, because we have these parties which really just want to be in the centre, just want to say the same things and just want to give this managerial point of view. And we're seeing that, people are rejecting this on both the right and the left. And, they don't feel that their opinions are being addressed at all. And this is... I think it's time for change. I mean, the House of Lords was mentioned there. Why not get rid of the House of Lords and replace that with a chamber with PR, keep first past the post in the Commons, and have a House of Lords based on PR. Of course, there's lots of different systems of PR as well. You don't have to go for the pure party list system. You could go for a much more regional-based system. We've got versions in Scotland and Wales. We can be imaginative with it, and it's... I remember time has come for change.
All right. Well, David, very interesting stuff there. That's the political editor of The Independent, David Maddox. And before that, it was the freelance journalist, Georgia Gillily. Now, folks, the government has said Britons should have 3 days' worth of tinned food and water. Is this really necessary? What should we be preparing for? We'll be discussing that after the break. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News, hosted by me, Darren Grimes. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to The Neil Oliver Show with me, Darren Grimes. Oh, wind-up torches, tinned meat and bottles of water. They're just some of the items that the government are advising people to stock up on as it urges the public to prepare for emergencies. Scouts Honour, be prepared. A new website called Prepare has been launched by the government to advise the public on what steps they can put in place in case of a variety of emergencies. Now, is this necessary, folks, or is this yet again more scaremongering from the government? Well, joining me to discuss this further is the author and journalist Julie Cook. Julie, thank you very much for your time today. Now, Julie, I'm looking at some of the items there, and it says you need a penknife. Now, I've never used a penknife in my life, to be quite honest with you. I wouldn't know where to start. So are they just on a hiding to nothing here?
Well, hi, Darren. First of all, I think, they said don't stockpile, don't panic buy. But the first thing people are going to do when they hear this kind of advice is to go and panic buy. And lots of things go through your head. Is it the war? Is it the threat of nuclear war from Russia? Is it the Ukraine disaster? Is it what's happening in Palestine and Israel? There's so much going on in the world to make us afraid. But is it really that, or is it more about compliance and kind of Project Fear Mark II? And I'm veering more towards that. I'm thinking, there's a general election called exactly the same time. And if there's any way to make the public behave and comply, it's to make them afraid.
Yes, I mean, we have gone through years of a mission creep, I guess, by successive governments into a more liberal sphere. I mean, is this part of a wider agenda, or do you think this is just common sense? And as I say, Scouts Honour, be prepared. I was taught that as a kid. Is it not just common sense and wise to actually prepare for all scenarios?
I think it's common sense. I think, most of us do have a few batteries in the cupboard or a candle or, a tin opener, for example. I think they are common sense. But I think by making a Be Prepared website and announcing it at the exact same time as a general election it's so much more than that. Yes, let's be prepared, but there's something else going on here. And it seems to me that general underlying sense of unease, anxiety that kind of keeps us compliant.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the logo that we've just had on screen there, for those that may be listening on radio, how would you prepare in massive letters, that capital bolding, really emphasising that word prepare. It's sort of, it reminds me a bit of George Orwell, dare I say. It might as well say Big Brother says, how would you prepare for an emergency? Am I going too far?
No, I don't think you are. And I think, as I said, Project Fear too, we've all lived through all of this with 2020 and the pandemic. And interestingly, in which we were told not to panic buy and stockpile when we kind of needed to. And now that there is no immediate defined threat, as I said, there are lots of threats, but nothing defined, we're told, right, go and get all this stuff. And, I think people have just had enough of being spoken down to and told to do the opposite. But equally, as I say, the timing doesn't escape most people's notice, with Rishi Sunak announcing this snap general election in July, which, has shaken everybody. To have this at the same time, as you say, with the big logo, the big website, it's fishy to me, Darren. It's fishy.
Well, fishy Rishi, that's what some people are calling him, Julie. But I mean, surely though, after the pandemic, right? Do you remember when everyone was rushing out of the shops and the shops were bare because people were stockpiling all sorts of loo roll? There were shortages of loo roll, and the loo roll companies, manufacturers, had to say, hang on a minute, we're not running out of loo roll, calm down. But actually, to avoid scenarios like that, is this just natural preparedness for eventualities that may arise? I mean, goodness only knows what could happen, but all eventualities ought to be considered, especially if you're, for example, someone with a young family.
Yes, of course. As I say, common sense. But most of us do have common sense. I think there's a sense of being talked down to a little bit, having some tins in the cupboard, having a tin opener, having some batteries and a torch. I'd say pretty much most of us have a few of those items anyway. But what interested me was it was the 3 days worth of food. And I think that's what's got people talking and panicking, because it's kind of like, well, if there's a nuclear disaster, it doesn't matter whether you've got 3 days or 30 days,
Yes.
It's game over, frankly. But if it's any other kind of disaster, I don't know, flooding, electricity problems, whatever, I mean, really, is 3 days of tins the answer? I think we live in such a sophisticated society now that's so dependent on technology, internet, phone. For example, you mentioned the wind-up radio. Well, how are we going to get the radio now that pretty much all of radio is digital anyway?
Yes.
They have the juice to get their programs out for us to get to. So, yes, it all just seems very obvious common sense, and yet there's no real defined threat of what it is we're meant to be prepared for. And I think that's what's getting people anxious.
All right, Julie, thank you very much for that analysis on the preparedness that the government is shouting in capital letters. Julie Cook there. Now, we're going to read out a statement from His Majesty's government who say this. The information on this site is designed to help you prepare for emergencies, be more informed about hazards, and get involved in activities to support yourself and your community before, during, and after an emergency. There's also specific advice for disabled persons and carers. Taking action now will make it easier to manage if an emergency does happen. Well, what say you at home? Do you actually view this as yet more scaremongering, or do you think actually, calm down, Darren, you're being a bit conspiratorial? We'll see what Georgia Gillenly thinks so, as well, the freelance journalist who still joins me in the studio. When you were reading all of this, because we're being told to print out a list of numbers.
I've not printed out.
Have you printed off a list of numbers? Did you dash and say, well, my phone might die of battery, so all these other things might happen? Preparing for all eventualities. Have you done it?
No, I think if I had children or something, I think it'd be something that was more at the front of my mind. I agree that governments instilling fear in people makes people more compliant, which can be useful for governments. However, our current government, I don't think they could organise a proverbial in a brewery. I don't think it's coordinated that this was released, and there's also a general election. I don't think it's coordinated at all. There's no evidence of that. I think to an extent it can be seen as patronising, but I also think that, as we're saying, with things being so digital now, you're saying, oh, most people might have a torch in their house. I don't actually have that. I just use my phone.
To be honest,
so many
Georgia,
things.
The amount of people that couldn't afford to get 3 days of supplies on top of their weekly shop.
Yeah, that's a lot, actually. I probably have maybe not even a day or something, depending. But I think people who may be a bit older, they have their own houses. When you have a house, things just accumulate. Like my parents' house, for example.
Absolutely.
We have
the
stuff,
space,
but if you're living in a flat in London, you're a young person.
Exactly.
You don't just have loads of kind of emergency things or lots of food, that kind of thing. I think the government might be aware that people sort of our age are a bit less prepared for
And a lot of people
today.
may well be saying this proves that they're all a bit out of touch, to be perfectly honest. But Georgia, thank you very much for your company today. That's freelance journalist there, Georgia Gillenly. Now, folks, that's it from me for this week on telly. But for more chats about the dangers of artificial intelligence, please do go online to the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. I'll see you there. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show online. I'm still Darren Grimes, and I thank you very much for your company. Now, Scarlett Johansson, she said that actually she was shocked and angered after OpenAI allegedly recreated her voice without her consent for a new ChatGPT artificial intelligence system. Now, OpenAI has denied that it was an intentional imitation of her voice. But is this a sign that this technology is running away with itself, perhaps getting a little bit out of hand? And do more controls and regulations need to be put in place to avoid such things happening again in the future? Well, joining me to discuss this further is the influencer and personality, Ollie London. Ollie, thank you very much for your company. Ollie, have you got sympathy with Scarlett here? Do you think actually listening to this, I believe the name was Sky, wasn't it? Listening to this Sky with OpenAI, that actually you could recognise obvious similarities between Scarlett Johansson's voice, especially in this film she did where she played artificial intelligence, and this Sky artificial intelligence app?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds remarkably similar. And Scarlett Johansson said herself that she had friends contacting her, believing the voice was her. There were multiple media outlets reporting the voice was hers as well. And the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, tweeted one word upon the release of the chat system. He tweeted the word her, which many, including Scarlett Johansson, took as a reference to her film, where she starred alongside Joaquin Phoenix, where she played a chat AI system, which is remarkably similar to the chat GPT system. So she has said that she's consulted with legal counsel. She was initially offered this a role voicing this Sky AI system. She declined due to personal reasons, but ChatGPT then hired an actress that sounded almost identical to the actress, so she certainly has cause for concern.
Yeah, Ollie, I mean, another person who's raised ethical concerns about OpenAI and ChatGPT in particular is Elon Musk, who I know you're a big supporter of. But Elon Musk is challenging OpenAI, I guess, through his own XAI. But I mean, what are in your opinion, what are the ethical concerns? It's not just the imitation of an actress's name.
Well, there are many ethical concerns. We've seen, songs being released. There was a Beatles song which did have permission, but they recreated John Lennon's voice. And I think the main concern is it takes away from the artistry, the talent and hard work of authors, singers, actors and actresses who, their voices or their image is worth a lot of money and it's valuable. They've worked hard to maintain that image. So in the case of Scarlett Johansson, I think it is damaging, and it's also misleading because many people are believing the voice is hers. So I think it's false advertising, and we're going to see more and more of this in the future, which is very similar to the Black Mirror episode on Netflix where Miley Cyrus played a singer, Ashley O, who entered a coma and her brain waves were recorded to create new songs. So I think that is the future. I think it is inevitable, and Elon Musk has expressed concerns with the efficacy of this and taking away from the rights and licensing rights of artists, their images and their voice.
Yeah, I mean, how troubling is this in politics? I mean, we live in an era where disinformation is the watchword of the moment, right? There's always a new politician somewhere proposing that we clamp down on so-called disinformation. But where do we actually draw the line? Because you're able to superimpose someone's face, for example, into a video. The video artificial intelligence is getting so good these days that you can barely differentiate between real life and the AI model. So where do we actually, how do we go about actually ensuring that people are aware that this is artificial intelligence that they're looking at?
Well, I certainly think they should put things in place, such as making sure, just like when you advertise on social media, you have to declare it's an ad with the Advertising Standard Agency, maybe some kind of declaration that it is AI or it's a deepfake, so people differentiate. Because we see this, whether it's wars ongoing in Ukraine or Gaza, we see a lot of AI images and videos being used, which confuses people and can result in the wrong information being believed, which has real-world consequences. So I think, perhaps an ad labeling system to explain that it is AI or it's a deep fake, so people differentiate, because as you said, some of these AI videos are so believable, people actually think they're real.
Yeah. Ollie, hold that thought for just 1 second. I'm going to get the thoughts of the freelance journalist, Georgia Gilley, who joins me in the studio. Now, Georgia, I use AI, right? Like, I find it boosts productivity and all these other things. If you're writing an email, for example, like a complaint, not to make myself sound like one of those miserable people, but, it's useful for those sorts of tasks. Now, where are you sort of ringing your bell and shouting, sanctuary, sanctuary, will someone save the planet from this awful AI? Or are you saying, actually, I think this is really beneficial? The new ChatGPT videos, for example, showing blind people by taking out their phones, the artificial intelligence can actually tell them what's going on in front of them and all the rest of it, giving them a pair of eyes through this device. That sort of thing strikes me as really revolutionary, really quite incredible.
Yeah, I think like all forms of technology, really, there are good things and there are bad things about it. I think when it comes to using the image of a real person and their voice, I think it's violating something quite sacred. I think we don't, even in modern society, necessarily have the vocabulary to express why that is wrong, but I think instinctively we know that it's wrong. And I think also, as Ollie was saying about in terms of reporting news, especially with ongoing wars, there is misinformation that kind of runs amok online, really. And I think we need ways for the companies providing these services to be more transparent. But I think, a lie travels around the world faster than the truth. And I think that it'll be difficult for governments and companies to kind of keep track of these things. But I have noticed that old people fall for it more when it comes to AI, and I think it's because if you're younger and you might use social media for work, or you're just on it a lot to talk to your friends, that kind of thing, there's kind of just something that you kind of imbibe about it, and you quickly realise kind of what's AI, what's not.
Yes.
Older people fall for it more easily. So maybe some more education about it too. But there clearly is an issue with these companies not being transparent. I think, as we were saying about the CEO of that particular AI company, displaying this link between Scarlett Johansson's film role and this AI technology, I think it's clearly evidence of some motivation. I don't know if she will have a legal claim.
Yes,
clearly some evidence of that. But sometimes there might not be evidence, so it's more difficult.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, disclosure and everything like that may well expose this as true, but who knows? We'll have to wait and see. Right, Georgia, let's bring Ollie back in. Ollie, I mean, you've heard what Georgia said there. The education element of actually saying to people, being able to recognise the signs of when something is fake and when it's real. But I wonder if one way of doing this is how Elon Musk's X does it, which is to have a community note, where people can actually write and say they're verified and all the rest of it, but they can say, look, here's this source that actually proves that this is a lie.
Yeah, I think it is important, like Georgia was saying, to have disclosure for labeling of AI and deepfake videos so that people can differentiate, because, old people do fall victim to this more and they believe it. And like Georgia was saying, a lie travels faster than the truth, and it can lead to real world consequences. And, on Twitter, obviously, they have the community note system, which is basically providing context to posts and provides sources if something is deemed to be incorrect that may confuse many people. So in terms of AI, we certainly need some kind of disclosure with that.
Yeah. Now, Ollie, the International Court of Justice, the UN's highest court, has actually ordered Israel to stop its military offensive in the southern Gaza city of Rafah. Now, the court said that the humanitarian situation in Rafah has deteriorated further since its previous court order, adding that the situation there was classed as disastrous. Now, it's not the first attempt at intervention, Ollie. As you know and as you've documented, South Africa put in an emergency request to the International Court for it to order Israel to stop its offensive in Rafah earlier this year, actually accusing Israel of committing genocide. Now, Ollie, I know this is a conflict that you personally have been following very closely indeed, and you've built up a lot of relationships with people on the ground. What are your thoughts on this latest development? Because there's a lot of, for example, criticism of the UN for the utilisation by Hamas, for example, of UN buildings in places like Rafah.
Yeah, well, the ICJ, ICC and the UN have lost all credibility within the last 7 months for their clear and blatant bias towards Israel. The bodies of 4 Israelis were found in a UN building. The body of Shani Look, who we all remember was the German-Israeli woman kidnapped from the Nova Festival, her body was found in a building funded by UNRWA and funded by the German government. So their bias is clearly showing. We also saw the United Nations Security Council stand the other day and have a 1-minute silence. The UN also lowered the flag to half-mast in Geneva and the United Nations New York headquarters to pay respects to the Iranian President Raisi, who was dubbed the Butcher of Tehran for his role as a judge in the executions of around 4,000 Iranian civilians. So, the bias is showing these organizations have lost all credibility. And today, of course, we saw the ICJ vote in a 13-2 vote with the president of the ICJ, who is Lebanese, who has in the past expressed anti-Israel sentiment, has written articles criticizing Israel in the past. He announced that the ICJ is demanding that Israel stop all ground operations in Rafah. And, Israel has just recovered the bodies of 3 more hostages. They were found dead. The boyfriend of Shani Look, a French-Mexican citizen, and also a Brazilian citizen. Their bodies were discovered today. So at the end of the day, the ICJ, the UN, all of them should be calling for the release of the hostages. Then the war will stop. This has been the number one point that the Israeli government has said from day one is release the hostages, Hamas surrender, and the war will be over tomorrow.
And it's only the other day, Ollie, that we had footage released into the world that shows young girls with their faces bloodied, and fearing for their lives. And these scenes are really harrowing, and it's a stark reminder of what happened on October 7th. Do you think actually the international community has forgotten that October 7th occurred in such a barbaric way?
Yeah, that video really reminded the world of just how harrowing and horrific October the 7th was, and also reminded the world of the harrowing situation these hostages are in, especially the females who, in that video, one of the Hamas terrorists pointed at the girls and said, these are the girls that we're going to get pregnant. So that tells you everything you need to know. 19-year-old Nama Levy was seen in another video being pulled out of a Jeep with her trousers covered in blood on the front and back, which we know what that is indicating, what happened to her. It is truly, truly horrific. And the United Nations and Red Cross have failed these innocent hostages. They have not once called for their release. They have not once demanded Hamas show them the hostages so they can check on their well-being. They've not provided any medical help. So I think it just shows you how corrupt and morally decrepit the UN has become. And at the end of the day, these are innocent people. While these 5 Israeli girls were from an army base, it does not separate from the fact that they were so horrifically abused and treated. No human being deserves that.
All right, Ollie, just finally then, there have been some calls by those on the left of British politics to actually bring over those in Gaza as refugees to the Western world, to places like the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Do you think actually we have a responsibility, as some have argued, if we're selling arms to Israel, to actually bring over those and allow them to seek refuge in this country?
Well, these activists should ask the question, why hasn't Jordan, why hasn't Egypt opened their borders for these refugees? Why has the Arab world, not a single country, offered to take them in? That is very telling. We saw after October 7th, multiple polls and research showed around 80% of the Gaza and West Bank population supported the attack on October 7th. Unfortunately, there are, of course, many innocent civilians, many innocent children, which are being caught up in this tragic war. But at the end of the day, Hamas is ultimately responsible for every single civilian. They use them as human shields. And, I don't think the UK should be taking in people. I think the neighboring countries like Jordan, which has 1/5 of their population is Palestinian, around 60% have Palestinian origin. They should be the ones taking in these refugees. When
the Queen of Jordan.
70% of Jordan was part of the British mandate of Palestine. So, if anyone has a responsibility to take in refugees, it should be Jordan.
All right, Ollie, great to speak to you as ever. I'm sure there'll be lots of agreement and disagreement there with Ollie London, but do let me know. And thank you to him for joining us. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show with me, Darren Grimes. Now, next up, folks, I say this every time, but I'm really looking forward to this next guest. Younis Sadagiani, a Persian British political analyst. He shares a lot of content that's considered brave, actually, in our politically correct and censorious age. He often goes viral on Instagram, on video responses, for example, like this one where actually he was responding to a group of Islamic protesters advocating for Sharia law in the streets of the United Kingdom. Now, his videos get millions of views, with viewers both in support and, of course, virulently opposed. Now, with the election sprung upon us, there's one issue that's predicted to be present in this upcoming election, and that's the rise of religious sectarianism. Now, Eunice says that the pandering to that sectarianism erodes British values in the name of political correctness. I want to discuss that. So joining me in the studio is the political analyst, Eunice Saragiani. Now, Eunice, thank you very much for your company. I'm also joined, by the way, in the studio by Georgia Gillilly, of course. Now, Eunice, we'll open it up then with, what was your journey to a realisation that you don't associate yourself with the brand of political correctness and, religious sectarianism that we're seeing so prevalent in British politics today?
Well, I'm a free speech advocate. By the way, thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of your show and the channel. So I'm a free speech advocate, and I believe in freedom of speech. And I believe that we should be able to criticize bad ideas in society. And Islam, some parts of it is a bad idea. I speak about everything on my page. I speak about the gender madness of LGBTQ, to toxic feminism, to the environmental hoax, to political correctness, all kinds of different things. The problem with Islam is that you cannot criticize it. And if you do, people tell you, well, it's okay for you to get death threats. And that is a ridiculous idea.
Does that happen to you?
Not so often. I think 99% of the time, people are extremely supportive and they actually agree with me. My barber is a Muslim guy and he watches my videos and he's like, I actually agree with you. We immigrated to this country and we have to respect the values of this country. And fundamentally, I believe that when you immigrate to a country, instead of the country having to adapt and assimilate to you, you have to adapt and assimilate to that country. And I think fundamentally in this country, we have got it the other way around. Recently I was in Italy and the Italians have kept their culture. In the future, if Iran is free, because I'm Iranian, and the Islamic Republic goes, and I would open up the country, let's say I'm president, I would say, cool, I'm all for multiculturalism. However, you have to adapt to our culture. Our culture is supreme because you came to our country, And fundamentally, the problem with Islam is that Muslims believe that they have a responsibility to Islamize the whole world. And that it says in the Quran. And they believe that it's a responsibility to impose Sharia law and impose Islamic law. And that has happened throughout history, all the way from Muhammad to Ali. And Islam grew by blood, and they forced people to convert to Islam. And if they didn't, they either killed them or they charged them more tax. And this is what worries me when I see people shouting Sharia for UK. I'm like, they are doing the things in this country, and you might not think it can happen to you, but it could happen to you because it happened to my country.
Yeah. And I wonder then, on that point, do you think there is because a lot of people may well be of the view, some Muslims will be saying, well, hasn't Christianity throughout history done the same thing?
Yes, it has. However, first of all, Jesus never killed anyone. And also the Bible is a book with a lot of stories. I'm not religious myself. Okay, I feel like all religions are man-made. I believe in God and I'm a deeply spiritual person. However, the difference with Islam is that Islam is an extremely militant religion. There's a lot of call to action in Islam. There's a lot of call to jihad in Islam. And if you look at the caliphates throughout history, they literally attacked countries, they ruined it, they killed people, and they say you either have to convert or we're going to kill you. And the same thing happened in Spain. Spain was, under the Islamic Caliphate for 200 years, and so was the Iranians, and it took them 200 years to get rid of them. The Crusaders were fundamentally a response to the Islamic caliphates. All religions have done wrong. I'm not denying that. Christianity, and this takes me to my next point. And as I said, I have nothing against Muslims. I come from a Muslim background myself. I have family members that are Muslim. The difference between Christianity and Islam is that Christianity went through its own age of Renaissance and its own age of enlightenment. And they've realized that they need to separate church and state. Like religion shouldn't mix with politics. The difference is that Islam is here to govern. Islam is a deeply political religion. And what I try to do with my page is to open discussion about Islam and to embolden other people to come and speak up. And fundamentally what you see now, you see countries such as Saudi Arabia, which is the birthplace of Islam, with leaders such as Mohammed bin Salman, which I like a lot. He has come to this realization that he cannot bring the Saudi Arabia to the 21st century if he wants to live by those traditional laws. And fundamentally, it's funny to me because the Islamic countries have come to this realization, yet people that were born in this country are asking for Sharia law. And I just find that extremely hypocritical and ridiculous.
Well, we'll get into a bit more of that, but we'll play a video so viewers get a taste of what your page actually gets up to.
Well, we recently had a lot of the students from UCLA and Columbia being expelled for causing an encampment outside their universities, basically trespassing, damaging to private property, taking some people hostage, beating some Jewish students up, all for the cause of Free Palestine. And I just wanted to say to these students, why don't you go to Iran or why don't you go in Gaza and live there for a year and actually experience oppression and what oppression really is?
Yeah, because I mean, whilst they all wax lyrical about how much they want to free Palestine, a lot of people, especially Israelis, for example, say, well, free Palestine from what? From Hamas.
Exactly.
Because they're the ones that would kill gay people, for example, right? There are gay people living as refugees in Israel to actually get away from the regime there. Do you think there's a lot of, I mean, do you sort of despair at the protests on the streets and the, dare I say, naivety of them?
Yes, and the most ridiculous thing I ever heard is queers for Palestine.
Yeah,
because
chickens for KFC.
Yeah, exactly, because they kill gay people in Gaza, they throw them off the buildings, and it's this whole oppressor versus oppressed narrative, because they think that the Palestinians are oppressed, which they are, but they're oppressed by their own leaders, which is Hamas, because Hamas and the Palestinians were offered a state 4 different occasions, and they said no every single time. Yeah. And that's why they shout river to the sea, because they're the ones that are actually genocidal against Israel. They believe that Israel shouldn't exist, okay? And fundamentally, I feel like a lot of Iranians are actually pro-Israel. And you would find that surprising because the Islamic Republic of Iran funds Hamas. However, because overwhelming majority of Iranians, they despise the Islamic Republic. And they know that they are the biggest state sponsor of terrorism, and that's why Iranians support Israel, because Israel is the front line of fighting this dangerous ideology. I understand that Israel has made a lot of mistakes, and I don't condone everything that they do. And I actually feel very sad when I see so many dead kids and, kids under 18 dying and women and everything. But fundamentally, this is warfare, and the warfare is caused by Hamas and by a dangerous Islamic ideology that believes that the Jews shouldn't live. I'm going to bring in Georgia. Georgia, looking at the people on the streets, I mean, you'll have seen yourself and no doubt have been thoroughly frustrated by the fact that they say things like, we need to free Gaza. Well, Gaza hasn't had the Israelis in it since, 2005? I mean, is there an ignorance actually attached to the movement?
I think, broadly speaking, most British people, including people who identify as, let's be real, they're not pro-Palestine, they're anti-Israel and anti the Jewish people in 99.9% of circumstances. But I think there are also people who know full well that that's the case, but they want Palestinians to live under an Islamic caliphate, and they want the same for other people in the Middle East, not just Jewish people, Christians too.
Yes.
I think you mentioned the river to the sea slogan. So the original slogan in Arabic was, I think, from the river to the sea, make Palestine Islamic, and they changed it for the English-speaking secular international audience. But that is what it's about. That's why this conflict goes on. It's not about this bit of land or that bit of land. It's about getting rid of a Jewish state in the Middle East.
Do you think actually in this country, Georgia, and I'll throw that question to Eunice as well, that actually we should have prescribed, in the same way we prescribed Hamas as a terrorist organisation, should we prescribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, for example, in this country?
I would definitely be open to that. I think it's just a bit different because it's attached to an actual government. But I think there's definitely enough evidence to suggest that should take place. But I do worry about how useful that would actually be, because we've prescribed Hamas and Hezbollah, but we still have people who openly support them, who kind of go about their everyday business. They've not even been arrested. We have former Hamas commanders, for goodness sake, living freely in the UK, living in bloody ex-council houses.
Ex-council housing, I know.
So I think the issue is broader than just categorising something as a terror group. And think about how many people out there would kind of pretend I'm not actually supporting Hamas, and then their actions speak otherwise.
I mean, Eunice, do you think that listening to what George has just said there on the sort of lackadaisical approach of the British state to the threat that is potentially posed, do you think do you look at the actions of this country and think that we're so laid back we might as well be horizontal?
Yes, and I think this is going to be the downfall of the West, political correctness and weak leadership. And the Islamic Republics is a terrorist organization because they support Hamas and Hezbollah, and they're the ones that fund them. So you prescribe Hamas and Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, but you don't do the same thing to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. And recently I had a friend of mine, he works for Iran International, Puria Zeraati, which was stabbed outside his house by the Islamic Republic's agents. So they are causing terrorism in this country, and they're stabbing people, and the reason why he was stabbed is because he's extremely critical of the Islamic Republic. And this happens, and he needs to live under police protection because of that incident. So if the Islamic Republic can do this in this country, why are we not being more firm? You know, and it just makes me think that maybe there is something happening behind the scenes, or maybe there's a geopolitical reason, or maybe there is a reason why they want to keep these guys in power. But I always say this to everyone. If Iran opens up, it is a gold mine. It is going to be the biggest economic opportunity in the world. So it is in the interest of the West and in the interest of the international community that the Islamic Republic of Iran goes and Iran is freed. And you will see a radical decrease in terrorism in the region if that happens. And unfortunately, what's happening now is that I think the war in Gaza is just a front. And behind Iran is Russia, and Russia is also connected to China. So, and I think they're all fighting it out in Gaza. And I think this is the battle between East and West.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to lie, the West has made a lot of sins in the past. They invaded countries illegally. They overthrew democratically elected governments. And now they are repaying the sins of the past, you know? And I want the West to win. However, the reason is that the Islamic Republic is being supported by Russia and China, and at this moment in time, the West, because of weak leadership, it doesn't look like they're going to win that war. And it's also because of what they've done. We had a lot of immigrants coming to this country, and now there's a rise of Islamism, and as in my video, there was a rise in pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine. So now they are overtaking us from within, and we are losing that battle.
Well, on that point then, we've got a general election coming up.
Yes.
How do we actually tackle and challenge religious sectarianism? Is there anything any of us can do about it?
Yes, there is. We have to be brave, and we have to speak our minds, and we have to criticize bad ideas. Unfortunately, parties such as the Labour Party, they pander to the Islamic vote. So are other parties. Conservatives and reform have to be the one that come out and speak up. I would ideally like to help in some manner if I could, but what I try to do with my page is to inspire other people to come and speak up, and networks such as GBNews and Talk TV or any other news outlets, they need to stop being so politically correct.
Yeah.
And we need to speak up about this. And it actually really worries me when I see people saying Sharia for the UK, or we have people shouting Allahu Akbar in Leeds after they win the councillor. And I'm like, you know, this is crazy for me.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia, given what you've heard there, I know this is something that concerns you too, right? You look at the state of the nation and think, goodness gracious me, what trajectory are we on? But is that what needs to happen? Do we just all need to be that little bit braver, maybe?
We absolutely do. Obviously, some of us have more of a luxury to be braver than others.
Yes.
If you're someone who's stuck in a job that you know if you say something you're going to get fired, and you have a family to look after, I get that. Being a journalist, it's kind of my job to
speak, to
be a bit rude about something. So, I'm in that luxurious position, thankfully, though I have received death threats, as I'm sure all of us have. I think being brave is one thing. Actually changing people's minds, or should we say imprisoning people who are terror threats, is a different thing. And there are some people who they don't want to change their mind. And kind of saying, yay, free speech, is not actually going to change those people. And also, you could say, to an extent, if we keep having high immigration from countries where there is a huge issue with Islamic extremism, with mass immigration, there's no incentive for those people to integrate, and we already have huge issues with integration. So speaking about it is not necessarily going to change the outlook looking forward in 10, 20, 30 years' time.
All right, folks, we're going to have to leave that there, but I could have gone on all day actually talking about that particular issue, and I'm sure many of the members of the audience actually agree with that. But Eunice and Georgia there, thank you very much for your time. Now, folks, you're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News with me, Darren Grimes. Neil, you'll be pleased to know, will be back next week. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good one.